When people talk about family, they usually speak of love, unity, and legacy. Mine was different. My legacy came wrapped in silence, betrayal, and the faint smell of old timber from the farmhouse that had been in my family for generations. My name is Margaret Hill, a 72-year-old widow who'd spent her whole life believing that loyalty was thicker than blood. That belief shattered the day my son-in-law laughed at my inheritance. I remember it vividly, the echo of his scoff slicing through the still air of my living room like a knife. He sat there, legs crossed arrogantly, his polished shoes gleaming in the afternoon light, his smirk sharp enough to draw blood. An old cabin and a few dusty acres. He had chuckled. I guess sentimentality really is priceless. My daughter Claire laughed nervously beside him, her eyes darting between us, silently begging me not to take offense. But I did. Not because of his words, but because behind his mocking tone, I saw something familiar. Greed. The same greed that had destroyed my husband years ago when his own brother cheated him out of the family business. I had thought that chapter was closed. I was wrong. The inheritance in question wasn't just an old cabin. It was my late husband's childhood home, a small, secluded property nestled in the Appalachian foothills. Most people saw only rot and dust. I saw history, birthdays celebrated under the oak tree, hand-carved initials on the porch railing, laughter echoing through the creaking floorboards. But more than that, I saw a chance to leave something meaningful behind for my grandchildren. A slice of their roots before the world turned everything into condos and parking lots. My son-in-law Jason didn't see any of that. To him, everything had a price tag. He was a financial advisor, slick-tongued and cold-eyed, always 2 steps ahead in the game of appearances. When he learned I had inherited the cabin after my husband's passing, his interest sharpened like a blade. I could feel it. He started visiting more often, calling more frequently, pretending to care about my health, asking small questions about what's next with the property. I wasn't born yesterday. I'd raised 2 kids during a recession. I knew when someone was sizing up my worth. For months, I played along. I smiled during dinners, let him pour me wine, nodded when he spoke of investment opportunities. But behind every polite nod, I kept my eyes open. Then one evening, after a particularly long dinner, Jason let something slip. He mentioned a potential buyer interested in the area where my cabin stood. A developer. Nothing serious yet, he'd said casually, but if the old folks around there ever decide to sell, they'd make a killing. My heart sank, but I hid it. He didn't know that I'd already received a letter, one with his name printed at the bottom, listing him as a consultant for that very developer. He was already trying to sell what wasn't his. That's when I decided to stop playing defense. I began to visit the cabin again, alone. The drive took nearly 3 hours through winding country roads, but each mile seemed to peel away years of worry. The cabin stood as stubbornly as ever, its wooden bones creaking but strong. Inside, I could still smell my husband's cologne in the air, faint but comforting. I spent hours cleaning, dusting, fixing what I could, but mostly I searched. Something told me that if Jason wanted the land so badly, there was more to it than just profit. So I started going through old family records, property deeds, letters, anything that might explain the sudden interest. That's when I stumbled upon a small leather-bound ledger hidden beneath a false drawer in my husband's desk. Inside were receipts, coded notes, and a list of names, most crossed out in red ink. It looked like an old debt ledger from the 1980s, back when my husband briefly ran a private contracting business. But one name wasn't crossed out. Harper & Co. Construction, the same company Jason had been consulting for. My heart pounded. Either fate had an odd sense of humor, or my son-in-law had dug himself into a much deeper hole than he realized. I made a copy of every page. Weeks passed as I quietly pieced together a puzzle that stretched back decades. Harper & Co. had been accused of laundering money through small land deals in the past, buying cheap rural properties, flipping them at inflated prices, and moving funds through shell accounts. And guess who had been advising their acquisitions division for the last 5 years? Jason Thorne, my charming, manipulative son-in-law. He wasn't just after my inheritance, he was using it to cover his own tracks. Every visit, every laugh, every kind word had been bait. I didn't tell Claire. My daughter had always been the peacekeeper, gentle and easily swayed by Jason's confidence. I knew if I confronted him outright, he'd twist the truth. Maybe even convince her that I was losing my mind. So I waited, gathering everything I could. Emails printed from a forgotten account my husband once used. Copies of public financial disclosures. Even a few voicemails Jason left me where he accidentally mentioned the deal. I planned carefully, quietly. Then fate handed me the perfect opportunity. One morning, Jason called with false cheer in his voice. "Margaret, how about a family trip to the cabin? We can all pitch in, clean it up, maybe even think about restoring it. You know, as a family." I smiled to myself. The trap was setting itself. "That sounds lovely," I said sweetly. "It'll be nice to spend time together." He couldn't hear the steel behind my voice. I drove up early, a day before the others, to prepare. The night before their arrival, I sat on the porch watching the sunset bleed into the mountains, clutching my husband's old rifle, not out of fear, but for courage. "We'll do this your way, Jack," I whispered. Quiet, careful, and true. The next morning, Claire and Jason arrived with their 2 kids. The little ones ran to hug me, their laughter breaking the tension like sunlight through clouds. Jason followed behind, all smiles and fake warmth. He acted as if we were one big happy family, snapping photos, commenting about potential renovations. But I noticed how he kept measuring the land with his eyes, how he made quiet notes on his phone when he thought I wasn't looking. I played my part perfectly. Over lunch, I casually mentioned that the land might not be as worthless as people assumed. "Oh," he asked, his fork pausing midair. "Why's that?" I shrugged. "Old surveyor told me years ago there's something under it, minerals or something." "Who knows, maybe it's worth more dead than alive, right?" I said with a chuckle. His eyes gleamed for a split second. "Sarim." That evening, after everyone had gone to bed, I pretended to retire early but stayed awake, listening. Around midnight, I heard faint footsteps outside, then the soft creak of the shed door. I slipped out quietly, careful not to wake the children. Through the window, I saw Jason hunched over a stack of old property maps I'd intentionally left on the workbench. He was snapping photos, muttering to himself. I recorded everything with the small camera I'd hidden in a flower pot earlier that day. When he left, I checked the shed. The maps were gone. Perfect. The next day, I pretended not to notice. We packed up and drove home. Jason looked satisfied, smug even. He thought he'd stolen something valuable. He had no idea he'd just handed me the evidence I needed. Over the following weeks, Jason became more confident, openly talking to Claire about opportunities and potential investors. I stayed silent, letting him dig deeper. Eventually, he couldn't resist. One night, Claire called me, her voice trembling. "Mom, Jason wants to know if you'd consider selling the cabin. He says we could put the money toward the kids' college fund." I took a deep breath. "Of course, honey," I said softly. "Ask him to come over tomorrow. We'll discuss it together." When Jason arrived the next day, he carried that same smug smile, the one that had once charmed my daughter and fooled the neighbors. He talked circles around the subject, trying to sound casual. "You know, Margaret, that land's just sitting there. You're not getting any younger, and taxes aren't cheap. I could help you sell it fast, get you a great deal." His confidence was sickening. I poured him coffee, smiled, and slid a brown envelope across the table. "You mean like this deal?" I asked. His hand froze midair. Inside the envelope were copies of every incriminating document, emails, bank records, photos, and a transcript of his midnight shed visit. His face drained of color. What is this?" he stammered. "Proof," I said quietly. "Proof that you've been using my property, my husband's name, and my trust to cover your dirty business. Proof that you're not just greedy, you're a criminal." For a moment, silence hung heavy in the air, broken only by the ticking clock on the wall. Then he laughed, low and bitter. "You think anyone will believe you? You're an old woman clinging to conspiracy theories." I leaned forward. "They don't need to believe me. They just need to believe the footage and the signed reports I've already sent to the state attorney's office." His expression changed instantly. Fear. Real, raw fear. He tried to speak, but words failed him. He knew I wasn't bluffing. He stormed out that day, slamming the door so hard it rattled the windows. Claire didn't understand what had happened, not yet. She begged me to explain, but I told her she'd know soon enough. Within a week, the headlines broke. Local advisor under investigation for land laundering scheme. Jason's face was plastered across every news outlet. Claire was devastated, but in her pain, she saw the truth. The man she'd married wasn't who she thought he was. I helped her through it quietly, never saying, "I told you so." Some lessons life teaches brutally. But the story didn't end there. A month later, a lawyer contacted me on behalf of the investigation. Apparently, one of Jason's business partners had confessed that the land he was trying to sell had a hidden clause in its original deed, one that granted mineral rights exclusively to the Hill family. That meant even if he had sold it, he couldn't legally profit from the resources beneath it. The irony nearly made me laugh. My husband had written that clause decades ago to protect the land from outsiders. It had done just that. I kept the property, restored the cabin, and turned it into a small retreat for veterans. A tribute to my husband, who had served proudly before life turned complicated. The first night we opened, I stood on the porch and watched the stars glimmer over the mountains, the same way they had the night I decided to fight back. I thought about Jason then, not with hatred, but with quiet satisfaction. He had mocked my inheritance, but it was that very inheritance that exposed him.